I devoted 25 years of my life to raising my grandchildren when my daughter Felicia couldn't handle being a mother. I cooked their meals, nursed them through illnesses, attended every school event, and gave them the love and stability they deserved. I even used my retirement savings to send them to college. But the day Beth got that promotion at her fancy law firm, she decided I was taking up too much space in her home, the very home I had paid for. She moved me into the damp basement, calling me a burden who should be grateful for the roof. What she didn't know was that the antique shop I had quietly run on weekends for decades had made me a millionaire several times over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. And this time, I'd make sure she realized that the price of betraying her own mother was far greater than she could ever imagine. I had just finished making dinner when Beth and her husband Drew came home with the news. I could tell something was off by the way they exchanged glances across the dining table, while my grandchildren Thomas and Mary chatted about their day. I had raised these children since Thomas was 3, and Mary just an infant when Felicia disappeared on a finding-herself trip to Europe that turned into a permanent escape from motherhood. "Mom," Beth said, placing her fork down with that precise, calculated movement she always used when delivering unwelcome news to clients. "Drew and I have been talking, and now that I've made partner, we need to make some changes around here." I smiled, assuming they were finally going to renovate the outdated kitchen I'd been cooking in for 2 decades. "That's wonderful, dear. The stove really could use an upgrade." Drew cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on his plate. "Actually, Norma John, we're thinking of converting your bedroom into a home office. Beth needs a professional space to bring clients occasionally." My hand froze midway to my water glass. "I don't understand. Where would I sleep?" "We've been fixing up the basement," Beth said, her voice taking on that detached, clinical tone I'd heard her use on phone calls. "It's quite comfortable now. There's a window, and we've put in a small bathroom. It would give you privacy, and frankly, it would be better for everyone." Thomas, now 28, looked up sharply. "Mom, you can't be serious. Grandma's 73. "Which is exactly why the first floor would be better," Beth countered smoothly. "No stairs to worry about during the day since she can use the side entrance. It's actually safer." "The basement floods every spring," Mary said quietly. At 25, she had always been the peacekeeper, but even she couldn't hide her discomfort. "We've had that fixed," Drew assured her, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed the lie. I sat there, feeling the weight of Beth's true message settling around my shoulders like a heavy cloak. After dedicating my life to raising her children while she pursued her career, I had outlived my usefulness. The home I had helped pay for, contributing my teacher's pension for the down payment when they were struggling newlyweds, was no longer mine to claim space in. "When would you like me to move?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "This weekend would be ideal," Beth replied, already scrolling through her phone. "I have clients coming next Wednesday." Thomas pushed his chair back forcefully. "This is ridiculous. Grandma raised us while you were building your career. She deserves better than a basement." Beth's expression hardened. "I provided the financial stability for this family. I paid for this house, the food, your education." "Grandma helped with my tuition," Mary interjected softly. With a small contribution, Beth dismissed with a wave. "Look, Mom had a good run upstairs, but things change. We all need to adapt." She turned to me with what I'm sure she thought was a compassionate smile. "It's not like we're sending you to a nursing home. Many people would be grateful to have family who want to keep them close." I gazed at my daughter, trying to reconcile. The woman before me with the little girl I had once rocked to sleep through countless fevers. The teenager whose tears I had wiped away after her first heartbreak. The young mother who had shown up at my door with 2 small children and a marriage falling apart. Somewhere along the way, success had hardened her, ambition reshaping her into someone I barely recognized. "You're right, Beth," I said finally, folding my napkin neatly beside my plate. "I should be grateful." That night, as I sat alone in my bedroom, soon to be Beth's gleaming home office, I thought about the choices that had led me here. After my husband Donald died when Beth was just 12, I had thrown myself into being both mother and father to her. When she struggled as a young single mother after Felicia abandoned her children, I had stepped in without hesitation, putting my own retirement dreams on hold. For years, I had maintained the fiction that my weekend hobby, selling antiques at a small shop downtown, was just something to keep me busy. Beth had always been dismissive of it, calling it my little distraction from the important work of childcare. What she didn't know was that over 30 years, I had built a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable antique dealers in 3 states. My little shop had quietly amassed a fortune through careful acquisitions and sales to private collectors. The blue ceramic vase sitting on my dresser that Beth had once called dusty junk, an 18th century Chinese piece worth more than her monthly salary. The old books in my bookcase, first editions that could pay for Thomas's medical school twice over. I had kept my success quiet, partly out of modesty, but mostly because I wanted to know that my family valued me for my love, not my money. As I looked around at the life I had built in this room, the photographs of graduations and birthdays, the handmade Mother's Day cards, the small treasures collected over decades, I realized with startling clarity that the basement wasn't just a room. It was a statement about my worth in Beth's eyes. I opened my closet and pulled out the worn leather portfolio I kept hidden behind my winter coats. Inside were bank statements, investment accounts, and property deeds that told a very different story about Norma Jean Wilson than the one my daughter believed. Tomorrow, I would begin making some calls. It was time for things to change. As I prepared for bed, I heard a soft knock at my door. Mary stood there, her eyes red-rimmed. "Grandma." "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Thomas and I tried to talk to Mom, but she wouldn't listen. I pulled her into a hug, smelling the same strawberry shampoo she'd used since she was 5. "Don't worry about me, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way." "What will you do?" she asked. I smiled, patting her cheek gently. "Just what I've always done. I'll adapt, but this time, on my terms." The morning light streamed through my bedroom window as I carefully packed away decades of memories. Each photograph and trinket had its own story. Thomas losing his first tooth during Sunday dinner, Mary's ballet recital where she froze center. Stage before I called out words of encouragement from the 3rd row, the 4 of us huddled under blankets during the blizzard of '07 when the power went out for 3 days. These weren't just mementos. They were proof of a life devoted to family. Most people saw me as just an aging grandmother with arthritic hands and outdated clothes. "Poor Norma Jean," they'd whisper at church functions, "still raising those children while her daughter climbs the corporate ladder." What they didn't see was the shrewd businesswoman who could spot an undervalued Chippendale desk at 50 paces or negotiate a colonial-era silver set down to a quarter of the asking price. I had come to antiquing by accident. After Donald died, his insurance money wasn't enough to support Beth and me long-term, so I started selling off some of our nicer pieces. An old dealer named Ron took pity on me and showed me the ropes: how to authenticate period furniture, identify valuable marks on porcelain, distinguish reproduction prints from originals. "You've got the eye," he'd told me after I correctly identified a fake Tiffany lamp that had fooled him. "And more importantly, you've got the patience. This business rewards those who can wait." And wait I did. While teaching elementary school during the week, I spent weekends at estate sales and auctions, slowly building inventory for the small booth I rented at Ron's shop. When he retired 15 years ago, I took over the lease, naming it Second Chances, both for the treasures I sold and for myself. I carefully wrapped a small bronze sculpture in acid-free paper. Beth had always hated it, calling it "that ugly little man on your nightstand." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She never bothered to learn it was a rare Viennese cold-painted bronze by Franz Bergmann, worth more than her BMW. I had purchased it for $75 at a garage sale from a widow who thought it was a worthless knick-knack her husband had collected. Need some help, Grandma? Thomas stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. Of my two grandchildren, he had always been the more sensitive one, despite his imposing size and the tough exterior he presented to the world. That would be lovely, dear. Could you bring those boxes down for me? I asked, gesturing to the stack by the closet. Thomas frowned. I still can't believe Mom is doing this, after everything you've done for us. I patted his arm reassuringly. Your mother has always been practical. She sees the world in terms of utility. You're not a piece of furniture to be moved around when convenient, he said, the muscle in his jaw twitching with suppressed anger. No, I'm not, I agreed quietly. And perhaps it's time I reminded her of that. As Thomas carried my boxes down to the basement, I took one last look around the sunlit room that had been my sanctuary for over 2 decades. The walls would soon be repainted in whatever fashionable gray Beth had selected from her designer's palette. My reading nook by the window would become space for some mid-century modern credenza that matched her aesthetic but lacked any soul or history. The basement was exactly as I'd expected, hastily cleaned but still carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew. A twin bed had been pushed against one wall, with my old dresser opposite. They'd installed a small bathroom with a shower stall, and there was a threadbare area rug attempting to hide the concrete floor. The single window well lit in minimal light, and I noticed watermarks on the wall beneath it, evidence of the spring flooding Mary had mentioned. This is criminal, Thomas muttered, setting down the boxes. It's temporary, I replied, with more confidence than I felt. Later that afternoon, as Beth supervised Drew and Thomas moving the last of my belongings, Mary sat with me at the kitchen table, clutching a mug of tea. I've been looking at apartments near me, she whispered. You could come live with me instead. I squeezed her hand. That's very sweet, but your studio barely fits you, let alone an old woman and her belongings. Then we'll find something bigger, she insisted. I have some savings. Keep your savings, I told her firmly. I'll be fine. Mary bit her lip, unconvinced. You know Mom's doing this because the Donalds are coming for dinner next month. He's the managing partner, and she wants to impress him with her home office. She told Drew it wouldn't look professional to have her mother hovering around. The casual cruelty of it stung, but I wasn't entirely surprised. Beth had always been concerned with appearances, even as a child insisting on the right clothes, the right friends, the right activities that would position her for success. Somewhere along the way, I had become another item on her checklist of things that either advanced or hindered her ambitions. Well, I said, rising from my chair with determination, we can't have me hovering, can we? That evening, once the move was complete, Beth knocked on my basement door, entering without waiting for a response. Another small indication of how boundaries had shifted. It's not so bad down here, is it? She asked, glancing around with forced enthusiasm. We could get some brighter lamps, maybe some art for the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling its thin mattress sag beneath me. It will do for now. Beth's smile faltered slightly. Mom, I know this isn't ideal, but it makes the most sense for everyone. My career is at a critical point, and this home office will help me secure my position at the firm. I understand priorities, Beth, I said evenly. I've always understood yours. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face before she smoothed it away with practiced ease. The Wi-Fi password is the same, and we've added a small refrigerator in the corner so you can keep some snacks down here. Dinner's still at 6 upstairs, of course. We want you to join us. How considerate, I remarked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Beth sighed, checking her watch. I have a conference call in 10 minutes. Is there anything else you need? Before I go, I looked at my daughter, professionally dressed, perfectly coiffed, emotionally distant, and made a decision. Actually, yes, I'll need a ride to my shop tomorrow. There are some business matters I need to attend to. Your shop? Beth's brow furrowed. Can't it wait? Drew and I are both busy and the kids have their own schedules. I suppose I could call a taxi, I mused, though it might take several trips to transport everything I need. Beth's impatience was palpable. Fine. I can take you at 9 a.m., but I can only spare half an hour. After she left, I pulled out my phone and called my attorney's office requesting an urgent appointment. It's time to revise some documents, I told his secretary, and I'll need copies of everything by tomorrow morning. As I lay in the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the house creaking above me, I didn't feel anger or even sorrow. Instead, I felt a strange sense of liberation. For 25 years, I had put everyone else's needs before my own. Perhaps being relegated to the basement was exactly the push I needed to finally step out of the shadows. At precisely 9 a.m., Beth pulled up to the curb outside Second Chances, barely putting the car in park before checking her email on her phone. The small storefront with its hand-painted sign and display window full of carefully arranged treasures looked modest from the outside, exactly as I had always intended it to be. I don't understand why this couldn't wait, Beth sighed, drumming, her manicured nails against the steering wheel. It's just a bunch of old furniture. I gathered my purse and the leather portfolio I'd brought with me. Some matters can't be postponed, dear, just like your conference calls. Beth frowned at the comparison. My work affects our entire family's financial well-being. This, she gestured vaguely toward the shop, is just a hobby that barely covers its own expenses. We all have our misconceptions, I replied cryptically. I should be finished by 3 if you can send Drew to pick me up. 3? Beth's voice rose in disbelief. Mom, I told you I could only spare half an hour. Then I'll find my own way home, I said, climbing out of the car with more agility than she expected. Don't worry about me. I didn't wait for her response before walking to the shop door, using my key to unlock it. The familiar bell tinkled overhead as I stepped inside, and the comforting scent of lemon oil polish and old books embraced me like an old friend. My assistant manager, Norma Jean, a coincidence of names that had sealed our friendship from the start, looked up from the inventory list she was reviewing. There you are! I was getting worried when you didn't answer my texts last night. It was a rather eventful evening, I explained, making my way behind the counter. Beth has decided I would be better suited to living in the basement. Norma Jean's eyebrows shot up toward her silver hairline. She did what now? Apparently my bedroom is needed for a home office to impress clients, I said, attempting to keep my tone light despite the heaviness in my chest. After everything you've done for those kids? Norma Jean shook her head in disbelief. That's low, even for Beth. I sighed, placing my portfolio on the counter. I've spent 25 years putting those children first. When Felicia abandoned them, I stepped in without question. I changed diapers when my friends were enjoying retirement cruises. I helped with homework when I should have been resting my arthritic hands. I sat through baseball games in the rain and ballet recitals that went on for hours. Norma Jean nodded sympathetically. You were more mother to those kids than either Felicia or Beth ever was. Beth provided financially, I acknowledged fairly. But money was always her answer to everything. Need help with a problem? Throw money at it. Need to show love? Buy something? Need to apologize? Make it expensive. While you provided the actual parenting, Norma Jean finished. Yes, I said quietly. And I don't regret a minute of it. Thomas and Mary are wonderful adults because they had stability and love. But somewhere along the way, Beth began to see my contributions as less valuable than hers. The emotional labor, the daily sacrifices, the constant presence, none of that registered as work in her mind. I opened the leather portfolio, removing the documents my attorney had prepared years ago. I've made sacrifices Beth knows nothing about. When Thomas needed braces, I sold my mother's pearl necklace, the only heirloom I had from her. When Mary wanted to attend that summer arts program, I took out a personal loan rather than tell Beth I didn't have the money. And all the while, you were building this. Norma Jean gestured around us at the shop that had grown from a single booth to a respected establishment with clients across the country. Beth thinks this place barely breaks even, I said with a small smile. She has no idea we did $1.2 million in sales last year, or that our online auction segment has tripled in the past 5 years. I had never flaunted my success, partly because I'd been raised to believe that discussing money was vulgar, but mostly because I wanted my family to value me for who I was, not what I could provide. When Beth had struggled as a young lawyer, with 2 small children, I'd covered expenses quietly, letting her believe she was managing on her own. When the children needed extras that her salary couldn't stretch to accommodate, I found ways to make it happen without undermining her role as provider. The Bergman bronze sold, Norma Jean informed me, changing the subject to business. That Japanese collector offered 20% above asking. The wire transfer came through yesterday. Excellent, I nodded, making a note. And the Eastlake dining set? Delivery scheduled for next week. The buyers are thrilled. They've been searching for that exact model for years. We spent the next hour reviewing inventory and planning upcoming estate sales. At 11, my attorney Ron arrived, his briefcase bulging with the documents I had requested. Quite the rush job, he commented with a raised eyebrow as he spread papers across the back office desk. Unusual for someone as methodical as you, Norma Jean. Circumstances have changed, I explained, filling him in on my new living arrangements. Ron's face darkened with each detail. I've never understood Beth. You've done more for those grandchildren than most parents do for their own kids? She sees the world differently, I said, attempting to be charitable despite my hurt. She sees the world selfishly, Ron corrected. Now, let's review these papers. The property transfer for the house is straightforward. Since you're the actual owner, despite the fact that Beth and Drew believe they've been making mortgage payments to the bank all these years, it had been one of my quieter arrangements. When Beth and Drew had struggled to get approved for their mortgage 20 years ago, I had purchased the house outright in a separate LLC, then created a payment structure that mimicked a traditional mortgage. They believed they were paying the bank. In reality, those funds went into a trust I had established for Thomas and Mary's education. And the shop? I asked. Currently held in your personal name, but we can transfer ownership to the same trust, or create a new entity. What are you planning, exactly? I took a deep breath, looking out the small office window to the shop floor where customers were now browsing among treasures whose value they could only guess at, much like Beth had done with me. I'm going to teach my daughter the difference between price and value, I said finally, and I'll need your help to do it. By 3 o'clock, when Drew arrived to drive me home, I had signed all the necessary paperwork, reorganized my financial holdings, and set in motion a plan that would either rebuild my relationship with my daughter or sever it completely. Either way, I would no longer be relegated to the basement of my own house, my worth diminished to the convenience I provided as an unpaid nanny and housekeeper. Productive day? Drew asked awkwardly as we drove, clearly uncomfortable with his role in my relocation. Very, I replied, watching the familiar streets pass by. I believe things are about to change considerably. That evening, as I sat on the edge of my basement bed listening to the family moving about upstairs, I felt an unfamiliar emotion surfacing. Not just determination, but something closer to righteous indignation. For far too long, I had silenced my own needs in service to everyone else's. Perhaps it was finally time to put myself first. The basement ceiling creaked with footsteps as Beth's dinner party unfolded above me. It had been 3 weeks since my relocation, and true to Mary's warning, Beth had invited the Donalds over to showcase her new home office and solidify her position at the firm. I sat in the small armchair I'd wedged into the corner, reading glasses, perched on my nose, reviewing quarterly statements from my investment portfolio. The numbers were impressive, even to someone who had watched them grow steadily over decades. Last year's strategic acquisition of rare Art Deco jewelry had nearly doubled my expected returns. A sudden eruption of laughter filtered down through the floorboards, followed by the clinking of expensive crystal. My crystal, in fact, a set I had purchased at auction and loaned to Beth years ago. She had long since forgotten they weren't hers. My phone buzzed with a text from Mary. "You okay down there? I can bring you a plate." I smiled at her thoughtfulness. "I'm fine, dear. Already had a sandwich." The truth was that Beth hadn't invited me to join the dinner party. "It would be awkward explaining why my mother lives in the basement," she'd said that morning. "And honestly, Mom, these are important connections for my career. I need everything to be perfect." Perfect, in Beth's world, didn't include a 73-year-old woman who might say the wrong thing or wear the wrong outfit, or somehow reveal that the polished, sophisticated image Beth projected wasn't entirely authentic. I had nodded and assured her I understood, and I did understand, far more than Beth realized. I understood that I had become an inconvenience, a reminder of humble beginnings that didn't fit with her carefully constructed narrative of success. Another text came through, this time from Thomas. "This dinner is unbearable. Donald is a pompous jerk. Mom keeps laughing at his terrible jokes. Wish you were here." I was typing a response when a sudden bang echoed from upstairs, followed by a splash and gasps. Then Beth's voice, high and strained. "It's fine. Just a little spill. Drew, get some towels quickly." I could picture the scene. Red wine splashed across Beth's pristine tablecloth, possibly even on someone's clothing. A minor disaster in the grand scheme of things. But for Beth, who measured herself against impossible standards of perfection, it would feel catastrophic. Sure enough, not 5 minutes later, the basement door flung open, and Beth's hurried footsteps descended the stairs. "Mom," she called, breathless and clearly flustered. "Do you still have that stain removal trick for red wine? Donald's wife just knocked over her glass all over my new tablecloth and the dining room rug." I set aside my papers. "Club soda and salt for the tablecloth. For the rug, you'll need white vinegar and dish soap." Beth nodded, turning to head back upstairs when she noticed the financial statements on my lap. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "What are those?" "Just some paperwork from the shop," I said casually. She frowned. "You should be careful with your finances, Mom. At your age, you're vulnerable to scams." The condescension in her tone stung. "I'm quite capable of managing my affairs, Beth." "Of course you are," she said in that placating voice reserved for children and the elderly. "I just worry. Maybe Drew and I should take a look at your accounts, make sure everything's in order." Before I could respond, Drew called down urgently. "Beth, the stain is spreading." With a final worried glance at my papers, Beth hurried back upstairs to salvage her evening. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy rain battering the small window above my bed. Water had already begun seeping in around the window frame, forming a puddle on the concrete floor. I placed a bucket beneath the worst of the leak and made my way carefully up the stairs. The kitchen was empty except for Thomas, who sat nursing a cup of coffee and looking slightly hungover. "Morning, Grandma," he mumbled. "Coffee's fresh." "Thank you, dear," I said, pouring myself a cup. "How did the rest of the dinner party go?" Thomas grimaced. Mom managed to save face with her wine stain solution, which she presented as her own brilliant household hack, by the way. Donald was impressed enough to tell her she's next in line for junior partner. "That's wonderful news for her," I said sincerely. Despite everything, I wanted Beth to succeed. "Yeah, well," She went right into discussing how they'd need to convert the guest room into a second home office once she makes partner, Thomas said bitterly. Mary asked where Grandma would sleep then, and Mom just waved it off with some comment about, "Cross that bridge when we come to it." I sipped my coffee, letting the information settle. So my basement accommodations were only the beginning, it seemed. By the way, Thomas added, looking more alert, there's water coming in down there. I noticed it last night when I went down to get the emergency flashlight during the storm. Yes, I've put a bucket under it for now. Thomas frowned. That's not right, Grandma. You can't live with leaks and flooding. It's temporary, I reminded him, though I was beginning to doubt that myself. Beth and Drew appeared then, both dressed for work despite it being Saturday. Emergency client meeting, Beth explained, grabbing a travel mug for coffee. We might not be back until late. Mom. Thomas said firmly, Grandma's room is leaking. There's water coming in from that window. Beth hardly paused in her morning rush. Put a bucket under it for now. We'll look at it next weekend. It's not acceptable, Thomas insisted. She can't live like that. It's a minor leak, Thomas, Beth snapped. Not everything is a crisis. Mom's fine, aren't you, Mom? 3 pairs of eyes turned to me, waiting for my response. I took another sip of coffee, buying myself a moment to decide how to play this. The leak isn't my biggest concern, I said finally. But I would like to discuss my living arrangements more generally when you have time, Beth. Beth glanced at her watch impatiently. Can we do this later? I'm already running late. Of course, I said calmly. Your work comes first. It always has. Something in my tone must have registered, because Beth paused at the door, her brow furrowing. But then Drew tapped his watch, and the moment passed. They left in a flurry of coats and car. Keys, the front door slamming behind them. Thomas looked at me with concern. You don't have to put up with this, Grandma. I know, I assured him, and I won't be, much longer. By afternoon, the rain had intensified. The single bucket in my basement room was no longer sufficient as water began seeping up through the concrete floor as well. The dampness penetrated everything, my clothes, my bedding, the few books I had brought downstairs. Mary arrived home from her shift at the hospital and came directly to check on me, her face falling as she surveyed the increasingly uninhabitable conditions. This is worse than I thought, she said, watching me place towels around the perimeter of the room to absorb the encroaching water. You can't stay down here, Grandma. I straightened up slowly, my back protesting after hours of bending to mop up water. No, I don't believe I can. Mary immediately began gathering my essentials. You'll stay at my place tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out something more permanent. I allowed her to help me pack an overnight bag, but as we were preparing to leave, the front door opened. Beth and Drew had returned early from their meeting due to the worsening storm. Where are you going? Beth asked, her eyes darting from the suitcase to my face. Grandma's coming to stay with me, Mary said firmly. The basement is flooding. Beth frowned, handing her umbrella to Drew. Don't be dramatic. It's just a little water. See for yourself, Mary challenged, gesturing toward the basement door. With an annoyed sigh, Beth descended the stairs, only to return moments later with her designer heels soaked and a look of dismay on her face. Okay, it's worse than I thought, she admitted. But the guest room upstairs is full of files and supplies for my home office. We can't possibly clear it out tonight. So where exactly is Mom supposed to sleep? Mary demanded. The bathtub? Beth ran a hand through her hair, visibly stressed. Don't be ridiculous. Mom can sleep on the sofa for tonight and we'll figure something out tomorrow. I stood quietly, my overnight bag in hand, watching the daughter I had raised argue against providing me with a proper place to sleep in the house I had paid for. In that moment, something inside me shifted. A final thread of patience snapping after being stretched. Too thin for too long? No, I said, my voice soft but firm. Beth turned to me, surprised. No? I will not be sleeping on the sofa, Beth, nor will I be returning to the basement once it dries out. Mom, don't be difficult, Beth sighed. We're all tired and— I've never been difficult, I interrupted, surprising her again. That's the problem. I've been accommodating to the point of erasing myself, but that ends tonight. The sudden steel in my voice stopped Beth's protests. For perhaps the first time in years, she really looked at me, not as an aging mother to be managed, but as a woman standing her ground. I'm going to Mary's tonight, I continued calmly. And tomorrow, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation about this family's future. Mary's studio apartment was tiny but dry, with a pull-out sofa that she insisted I take while she slept on an air mattress on the floor. Rain continued to lash against the windows as we shared a simple dinner of delivered pizza, the storm outside, mirroring the emotional turbulence I felt within. I can't believe, Mom, Mary said for perhaps the 10th time that evening. How could she expect you to sleep in a flooding basement, or even on the sofa? I took a small bite of pizza, chewing thoughtfully, before responding. Your mother has always been focused on appearances. The facade matters more than the foundation. But it's not just appearances, Mary argued. It's basic respect. After everything you've done for us. That's just it, I interrupted gently. Beth doesn't see what I've done as valuable. In her mind, financial provision is the only contribution that counts. Mary looked stricken. That's not true. Money isn't everything. No, I agreed. But to Beth, it's the measuring stick of worth. It always has been. We fell silent for a moment, the rain filling the conversational void. Finally, Mary spoke up, her voice hesitant. Grandma, can I ask you something? At my nod, she continued. Your shop, is it really just breaking even? Because sometimes when I stop by, it seems really busy. I smiled faintly. Why do you ask? Mary shrugged, a bit embarrassed. It's just something Mom always says, that you're stubborn about keeping it open even though it doesn't make money. But you've always seemed too smart for that. And you've never asked for financial help, even when we were growing up and you were supporting us on a teacher's salary. Your mother believes what she needs to believe, I said carefully. She needs to see herself as the provider, the successful one. So the shop does make money? Mary pressed. I hesitated. Years of financial privacy warring with my new resolution to stop hiding my truth. Yes, I admitted finally. The shop has been quite successful for many years. Mary's eyes widened. How successful? Successful enough that I could have moved out at any point over the last 20 years, I said. Successful enough that I actually own the house you all live in. Mary's jaw dropped. What? But Mom and Drew make the mortgage payments every month. To an account I established, I explained. I purchased the house outright when they were struggling to get approved for a mortgage. They believe they're paying the bank, but they're actually building equity in a trust I set up for you and Thomas's education. Mary sat back, visibly processing this revelation. Does Mom know this? No, I admitted. And there's more she doesn't know. I rose from the sofa bed and retrieved my handbag, removing the financial statements I'd been reviewing when the basement began to flood. I handed them to Mary, watching as her eyes grew progressively wider as she scanned the figures. Grandma, she whispered, this says you have assets of over $4 million. 4.3, as of last quarter, I corrected gently. The antique business has been very good to me, especially once I began focusing on rare collections and museum-quality pieces. Mary looked up at me, bewildered. But why live in the basement? Why let Mom treat you like a burden? I finished for her. Because I wanted to be valued for who I am, not what I have. I wanted Beth to respect me as her mother, as the woman who raised her children, not as a convenient source of money. I took back the statements, folding them carefully. I never intended to use my financial situation as leverage. That seemed manipulative. But I've realized that by hiding my success, I've enabled Beth's disrespect. I've allowed her to believe a narrative that isn't true, that I'm dependent on her charity. "So, what are you going to do?" Mary asked. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "Tomorrow, I'm going to tell the truth. All of it."
That night, as I lay awake listening to the storm, I found myself lacking on the line that had led to this moment. After adult died, I had been so fighting set Beth.
To ensure she learned the value of things beyond money. When Felicia abandoned her children and Beth struggled to balance her career with parenting, I'd stepped in without hesitation, but perhaps too completely, allowing her to pursue success, without confronting the sacrifices parenthood demands. Had I enabled the very selfishness I now found so painful? By quietly solving problems, by hiding my own accomplishments, by making sacrifices without acknowledgement, had I taught Beth that others existed primarily to facilitate her comfort and convenience? The thought was uncomfortable, but illuminating. I had spent decades molding myself around the needs of others, becoming so transparent in my own wants and needs that Beth had stopped seeing me altogether. I had become furniture in her life, useful when needed, ignored when not, and apparently now suitable for storage in a damp basement. Morning brought clear skies and a text from Beth. Basement dried out. Drew set up dehumidifier. When will you be back? No apology. No acknowledgement of the disrespect. No recognition that her own mother deserved better than a hastily remediated flood zone. I texted back, "Meeting at my shop at 2 p.m. Please have Thomas and Drew attend as well." Beth replied immediately, "Can't do 2. Have client meeting. Why do we all need to be there?" "Because we're discussing the future of this family," I wrote. "My attorney will be present. Move your meeting." There was a long pause before her response. "Attorney? What's going on?" 2 p.m. at Second Chances, I repeated. "Don't be late." I turned to Mary, who had watched this exchange with growing interest. "Ready to help your old grandmother shake things up a bit?" Mary grinned. "More than ready." We spent the morning at Second Chances, where Norma Jean had already set up the back office for our meeting. My attorney Ron arrived early, reviewing the final documents I would need. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" he asked, concern evident in his expression. "Once we do this, there's no going back." "I'm certain," I said firmly. "It's time for the truth." At exactly 2 p.m., the shop bell rang as Beth entered, her face tight with barely contained irritation. Drew and Thomas followed behind her, both looking uncertain about what was to come. "Mom, what is this about?" Beth demanded, ignoring the greetings from Norma Jean and Ron. "I had to reschedule an important client for this." "Sit down, please," I said, gesturing to the chairs arranged around the small conference table. "This won't take long, but it is important." Beth remained standing, arms crossed. "If this is about the basement, we've fixed the leak. It won't happen." "Again?" "This isn't about the basement," I said calmly. "At least not directly. This is about honesty and consequences." "Consequences?" Beth repeated, her eyebrows rising. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, feeling strangely calm despite the momentousness of what I was about to do. "Beth, do you know what this shop earned in sales last year?" She glanced around dismissively. "A few $1,000s? Enough to cover expenses? Maybe?" $1.2 million, I said clearly. Beth's arms uncrossed in shock. "That's not possible." "Not only is it possible, but it's actually lower than our projections for this year," I continued, nodding to Norma Jean, who handed me the sales reports. "But," Beth stammered, finally sinking into a chair, "it's just old furniture and junk." It's American history, European craftsmanship, Asian artistry, I corrected. And to the right buyers, it's worth quite a lot. Thomas leaned forward, intrigued. So, you've been running a successful business all this time? That's amazing, Grandma. Beth was still shaking her head in disbelief. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why let us think that I was barely getting by? I finished for her. Because I wanted to know that you valued me for me, not for my money. Clearly, I was mistaken about that. Beth flinched as if I'd slapped her. That's not fair, isn't it? I asked quietly. You moved me to a basement that you knew flooded regularly. You excluded me from dinner parties because I didn't fit your professional image. You complained about supporting me when in fact I've been supporting this family for decades. I nodded to Ron, who slid a folder across the table to Beth. This is the deed to your house. You'll notice that it's owned by an LLC called Wilson Family Holdings. I am the sole owner of that LLC. Beth's hands trembled as she opened the folder, her eyes scanning the document before her. The color drained from her face as she registered what she was seeing. This can't be right, she whispered, looking up at me with genuine shock. We've been making mortgage payments for 20 years. To an account I established, I explained, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. When you and Drew were trying to buy your first home, you were rejected for a mortgage 3 times. Do you remember? Beth nodded slowly, her professional composure cracking. Our credit wasn't good enough. The interest rates they offered were predatory. So I purchased the house outright, I continued, and created a payment structure that mimicked a traditional mortgage. You believed you were paying the bank, but you were actually building equity in a trust I established for Thomas and Mary's education and future. Drew leaned forward, taking the document from Beth's limp fingers. Are you saying we don't actually own our home? That we've been… what? Renting from you all this time? Legally, yes, Ron interjected, his tone professionally detached. Mrs. Wilson retained ownership while creating a beneficial arrangement that protected your family from predatory lending practices. Thomas let out a low whistle. So all those times Mom complained about supporting Grandma, I was actually the one supporting all of you, I finished quietly. Beth's shock was transforming rapidly into indignation. Why didn't you tell us? Why keep this secret for 20 years? I folded my hands on the table, meeting my daughter's gaze directly. At first, it was to protect your pride. You were so determined to make it on your own, to prove you could provide for your children. Then, as time passed, it became clear that you measured your worth, and everyone else's, by financial success and independence. I wanted you to value me as your mother, not as your banker. That's manipulative, Beth snapped, finding her footing in anger. Perhaps, I acknowledged, but no more manipulative than moving your mother to a flooding basement to make space for a home office, than expecting gratitude for the arrangement. Mary, who had been quietly observing from the corner, stepped forward. Mom, Grandma raised us while you built your career. She was there for every school play, every doctor's appointment, every nightmare and skinned knee. She made our lunches, helped with our homework, and taught us how to be decent human beings. And your response was to stick her in the basement and treat her like an inconvenience. Beth's eyes glistened with unshed tears of frustration. That's not fair. I've supported this family financially for years. I've worked 80-hour weeks to give you opportunities I never had. No one is diminishing your contributions, I said gently. But you have consistently diminished mine. You've acted as though financial provision is the only valuable contribution to a family. And in doing so, you've taught your children that people are only worthwhile if they're financially productive. Beth fell silent, her usual quick retorts failing her. I nodded to Ron, who produced another folder. This contains the full accounting of my financial holdings. As you can see, the antique business has been quite profitable. I've built a portfolio worth approximately $4.3 million through careful investments and acquisitions. Beth's eyes widened as she scanned the documents, her financial training allowing her to quickly grasp the extent of what she was seeing. "How?" she whispered. "How did you do this without any of us knowing?" I smiled faintly. "Not everyone broadcasts their success, Beth. Some of us prefer to be underestimated. It provides a certain freedom. Freedom to what? Hide the truth from your family?" There was a bitter edge to her voice now. "Freedom to be loved for who I am, not what I have," I corrected, though clearly I failed in that regard. A heavy silence fell over the room. Thomas was the first to break it, his voice thick with emotion. "Grandma, I had no idea. All these years, you've been incredible." Drew was staring at the financial statements, his expression shifting from shock to something like respect. "These returns are impressive by any standard. You've outperformed most professional fund managers I know." Mary moved to stand beside me, placing a supportive hand on my shoulder. "So what happens now?" It was the question hanging in the air, the one everyone was afraid to ask directly. What would I do with this revelation? What consequences would follow Beth's treatment of me? I took a deep breath. "Now, we make some changes." I turned to Beth, whose face remained a complex mixture of shock, embarrassment, and defensive anger. "First, I will not be returning to the basement. Effective immediately, I'm purchasing the Victorian on Maple Street, the gray one with the wraparound porch that I've always admired. The closing is scheduled for next week." Beth swallowed hard. "You're moving out?" "Yes," I said simply. "It's time I had my own space, don't you think? After all, I wouldn't want to be in the way of your career advancement." The echo of her own dismissive attitude wasn't lost on Beth, who had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Second," I continued, "I'm restructuring the ownership of your home. The trust will remain in place for Thomas and Mary's benefit, but you and Drew will need to sign a formal lease agreement if you wish to continue living there." Drew's head snapped up. "You're going to charge us rent? After 20 years? "Fair. Market rent," I clarified, "which, given the neighborhood's appreciation, is considerably more than your current monthly payments." The color that had drained from Beth's face now returned in a flush of anger. "This is punishment. You're punishing me for the basement situation." "No, Beth," I said evenly. "This is consequence. This is what happens when you treat people as though their value lies solely in their utility to you. This is the natural result of prioritizing appearance over substance, ambition over compassion." Beth stood abruptly, her chair scraping across the hardwood floor. "I don't have to sit here and be lectured about my shortcomings. I've worked hard my entire life. I've made sacrifices you can't even imagine." "Sacrifices?" I echoed, feeling decades of silent acceptance finally cracking. "Let me tell you about sacrifice." "Beth, sacrifice is raising your grandchildren as if they were your own when their mother abandoned them and their grandmother was too busy building her career to be present. Sacrifice is putting your retirement dreams on hold for 25 years to provide stability for children who aren't even yours to raise. Sacrifice is watching your own daughter become someone who would relegate you to a flooding basement and still loving her anyway." The shop had gone completely silent. Even the usual creaks of the old building seemed to have paused in deference to the moment. "I never asked you to raise my children," Beth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I agreed softly. "You didn't ask. You expected. Just as you've expected everything else in your life to arrange itself around your convenience." Thomas stood, his substantial frame somehow making him seem more vulnerable than imposing in that moment. "Mom, you know Grandma's right. You've always put your career first. And that was your choice to make. But don't pretend it didn't come with costs. Costs that Grandma paid, not you." Beth turned to her son, visibly stung by his words. "So you're taking her side?" "There shouldn't be sides," Mary interjected. "This should be about recognizing Grandma's contributions and treating her with the respect she deserves." Beth looked around the room, suddenly seeming to realize she was alone in her position. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining out of her. "What do you want from me, Mom? An apology? Fine. I'm sorry about the basement. We should have found a better solution." The apology was so grudging, so clearly designed to end the conversation rather than address the deeper issue, that I almost laughed. Instead, I shook my head slowly. "What I want, Beth, is for you to see me. Really see me. Not as an extension of yourself, not as a convenient childcare provider, not as a burden to be managed, but as a complete human being with value beyond what I can do for you." Beth's mouth opened, then closed again, words failing her. "I don't expect that revelation to come today," I continued, gathering my papers. "But perhaps now that you know I'm not financially dependent on you, that in fact, quite the opposite is true. You might begin to question some of your other assumptions about worth and value." I stood, signaling that the meeting was concluding. "Ron will be in touch about the lease agreement. I'll arrange to have my remaining belongings moved from the basement this week." As the others filed out, Beth remained seated, staring at the financial documents before her as if they contained some code she couldn't quite decipher. When we were alone, she finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "All this time," she said quietly, "all this time you could have said something." "Would it have changed how you saw me?" I asked. "Or would you have simply seen me as a convenient source of financial support, rather than a convenient source of childcare?" She had no answer for that, and perhaps that was answer enough. The Victorian on Maple Street had always captured my imagination with its dignified gray clapboards and intricate white trim that reminded me of delicate lace. Standing on the wraparound porch with the heavy iron key in my hand, I felt a curious mixture of triumph and trepidation. At 73, I was finally, truly, on my own. The week following the revelation at my shop had passed in a whirlwind of paperwork and planning. Ron had expedited the closing on the house. Mary and Thomas had helped pack my remaining belongings from the basement, and Norma Jean had coordinated deliveries of furniture from my inventory that I'd quietly set aside over the years. Pieces, too beautiful to sell, saved for the home I never quite believed I'd have. "It's perfect," Mary said, joining me on the porch. "It suits you." I smiled, turning the key in the lock. It's certainly a step up from the basement. The house welcomed us with gleaming hardwood floors and tall windows that bathed the rooms in amber afternoon light. While not ostentatious, it had a quiet dignity that spoke of history and permanence, qualities I had always valued but rarely claimed for myself. "Thomas is bringing the last boxes," Mary said, setting down the potted fern she'd carried from the car. "Mom hasn't said a word to him all week," I sighed, running my hand along the carved banister of the staircase. "She's processing. Beth has always retreated when her worldview is challenged." "But she moved you to the basement," Mary persisted. "She treated you like you were nothing." "Not nothing," I corrected gently. "Something convenient. There's a difference." Mary's expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about all those years, how you were really the one supporting us, not just emotionally but financially too. All those times Mom acted like she was carrying the whole burden alone." "Your mother did work very hard," I reminded her. "She built an impressive career while raising 2 children. That's not easy, even with help." "But she made you feel like a burden when you were actually the foundation holding everything together," Mary insisted. "How are you not furious with her?" The question gave me pause. I looked around at the sunlit sitting room, trying to organize thoughts I'd carried for decades but rarely examined directly. "When your mother was 14, I began, gesturing for Mary to join me on the window seat. "Her father died very suddenly. Donald was the center of her world. He encouraged her ambitions, celebrated her intelligence, believed she could achieve anything she set her mind to. Mary nodded. She'd heard parts of this story before, though perhaps not the deeper truths. I was about to share. What I never told Beth was that Donald left us deeply in debt. He had made risky investments, borrowed against our modest savings, even taken out a second mortgage without telling me. When he died, I discovered we were nearly bankrupt. Mary's eyes widened. I never knew that. No one did, I said quietly. I worked 3 jobs to keep our house, to maintain the appearance that nothing had changed, because I didn't want Beth to lose her father and her security in one blow. I sold my jewelry, picked up evening shifts at the hospital cafeteria, did bookkeeping for local businesses on weekends, anything to keep us afloat. That must have been exhausting, Mary said softly. It was, I acknowledged. But do you know what Beth saw? She saw a mother who was suddenly absent much of the time, who was too tired to help with homework or attend school functions, who wasn't the emotional support she desperately needed while grieving her father. Understanding dawned in Mary's eyes. So she decided money was what mattered most. Because from her perspective, pursuing money had become my priority over her, I finished. She concluded that financial security was the most important thing, more important than presence, than emotional connection. I turned to gaze out the window at the maple trees that gave the street its name, their leaves beginning to hint at the coming autumn. I never corrected that impression. I was so focused on providing material stability that I didn't see how it was shaping her understanding of value and worth. But that doesn't excuse how she treated you, Mary protested. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But it helps me understand it. Beth measures love through financial provision because that's how I unintentionally taught her to measure it. When she became successful, she believed providing financially was enough, that emotional support, time, and presence were secondary concerns. Thomas appeared in the doorway, carrying the last of my boxes. The basement's officially empty, he announced, setting them down. And so is my gas tank. That's the 4th trip today. I smiled at my grandson, this kind young man who had somehow escaped inheriting his mother's harder edges. Thank you, Thomas. I can't tell you how much I appreciate both of you helping me with this move. It's the least we could do, he said, joining us by the window. Besides, this house is amazing. Way better than that depressing basement. Mary filled him in on our conversation, and Thomas listened thoughtfully, his expression growing more serious. That explains a lot about Mom, he said finally. She's always equated money with love. When I decided to go into social work instead of law like she wanted, she acted like I was rejecting her love by turning down the tuition for law school. The observation was astute, and I nodded in agreement. Your mother expresses love through financial support. When that expression is rejected, she feels personally rejected. So when you revealed you didn't need her money, that you were actually the one supporting the family all along, Mary began. It undermined her entire identity as the family provider, I finished. And beyond that, it forced her to confront the fact that she had mistreated the person who had made her success possible. We sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the newly polished floors. Finally, Thomas spoke up. Grandma, I have to ask, why did you wait so long to tell the truth? About the money, the house, all of it? It was the question I had been asking myself repeatedly since the confrontation at the shop. Why had I allowed myself to be diminished for so many years? Why had I hidden my success, my financial independence? I said slowly, I was afraid that if Beth knew I didn't need her financially, she wouldn't need me at all. That the only value I had in her life was as someone who cared for her children while she built her career. I feared that without that purpose, I would become truly invisible to her. Mary reached for my hand, squeezing it gently. That's heartbreaking, Grandma. It's also a failure of courage on my part, I admitted. I should have been honest years ago. I should have insisted on being seen and valued for all that I am, not just for what I could provide. Thomas leaned against the windowsill, his expression thoughtful. So what happens now? With Mom, I mean. That depends largely on Beth, I said. I've laid the truth bare. How she responds to it will determine where we go from here. As if summoned by our conversation, there was a sharp knock at the front door. Through the beveled glass, I could make out Beth's silhouette on the porch, rigid and formal even in shadow. Mary and Thomas exchanged worried glances. "Do you want us to stay?" Mary asked. I shook my head, standing up and smoothing my skirt with suddenly nervous hands. "No, I think your mother and I need to have this conversation alone." As my grandchildren gathered their things, preparing to leave through the back door, I made my way to the front entrance. For a moment, I paused with my hand on the doorknob, gathering my strength for whatever confrontation awaited. When I finally opened the door, Beth stood on the porch, her expression unreadable, a thick folder clutched in her hands like a shield. "Mother," she said formally, "I think we need to talk." I stepped aside, inviting her into my new home, the first space that had been truly mine in more than 2 decades. "Yes," I agreed, closing the door behind her. "I believe we do." Beth stood in the center of my new living room, her eyes cataloging every detail with the same sharp assessment she brought to contract negotiations. I watched her take in the antique Eastlake settee positioned by the fireplace, the hand-knotted Persian rug in deep jewel tones, the gleaming cherry secretary desk. In the corner. "This is unexpected," she finally said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "The house or the furnishings?" I asked, moving to the kitchen to put on a kettle for tea. Beth followed, her heels clicking precisely on the hardwood floors. "All of it? This place must have cost—" She stopped herself, catching the inappropriate turn of her thoughts. "Yes?" I prompted, filling the kettle and placing it on the stove. She sighed, setting her folder on the kitchen island. I was about to ask what it cost, which is exactly the problem, isn't it? I immediately think about the financial dimension rather than simply appreciating your new home. It was a surprisingly self-aware admission, and I acknowledged it with a small nod. "Old habits." "Very old," she agreed, her fingers drumming nervously on the folder she'd brought. "I've been thinking about what you said at the shop, about how I measure everything by financial value." I reached for 2 teacups from the cabinet, my grandmother's china that I'd kept carefully preserved through each move, each life transition. "And what conclusions have you drawn?" Beth watched me arrange the cups on saucers, her expression flickering between defensiveness and something more vulnerable. "I don't think it's that simple. Yes, I value financial security and success, but that doesn't mean I only value people for their monetary contributions. Doesn't it?" I asked quietly, meeting her gaze. "You moved me to the basement because I was no longer financially productive. You excluded me from your dinner party because I didn't enhance your professional image. When the basement flooded, your solution was the sofa, not your bedroom, not a hotel, not any accommodation that might inconvenience you or recognize my dignity." The kettle began to whistle, its high-pitched cry filling the momentary silence between us. I turned to remove it from the heat, giving Beth a moment to compose her response. "I've been unfair to you," she finally said, the words coming slowly, as if each one cost her considerable effort. "And disrespectful." "I see that now." I poured hot water over the tea bags, the familiar ritual steadying my hands. "Thank you for acknowledging that." "But," she continued, unable to let the concession stand alone, "you've been unfair too. You hid your financial situation from me for decades. You let me believe I was supporting the family when you were actually the one with the resources. You manipulated me." I handed her a cup of tea, then took my own and gestured toward the living room. We settled into chairs opposite each other, the coffee table between us like neutral territory. "You're right," I said simply, surprising her. "I did hide the truth from you. That was wrong of me." Beth blinked, clearly having prepared for an argument rather than agreement. "Then why did you do it?" I took a sip of tea, gathering my thoughts. "At first, it was to protect your pride. You were so determined to be self-sufficient, to not need anyone's help. Then, as time passed and your attitude toward me shifted, I worried that if you knew I had money, that would become the only reason you valued me." "That's not fair," Beth protested. "I'm not that mercenary." "Aren't you?" I asked gently. "When I lost my job at the school due to budget cuts, your first response was concern about how I would contribute to household expenses, not whether I was upset about leaving a career I loved." Beth's gaze dropped to her teacup. "I was being practical." "You were reducing me to my financial utility," I corrected. "Just as you've always done with everyone in your life, including yourself." "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I explained carefully, "that you've internalized the idea that your worth as a person is measured by your productivity, your financial success. And because you believe that about yourself, you apply the same standard to others." Beth was silent for a long moment, her expression shifting through a complex series of emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was uncharacteristically hesitant. "When Dad died, you changed. You were always working, always worried about money. I learned that financial security was what mattered most, because that's what you prioritized over everything, even over being present for me." The observation struck, with painful accuracy. "You're right," I acknowledged, the admission catching in my throat. "I was so focused on keeping us financially afloat that I neglected your emotional needs. I thought providing stability was enough. I was wrong." Beth looked up, clearly surprised by my candor. "I've never heard you admit that before." "Perhaps because you've never raised it before," I pointed out. "Our family has a long history of leaving important things unsaid." A ghost of a smile touched Beth's lips. "Like the small matter of your multi-million-dollar fortune?" "Among other things," I agreed, returning the smile cautiously. Beth reached for the folder she'd brought, opening it on the coffee table. "I had our accounting department analyze the documents Ron provided. The house, your investment portfolio, the business, it's all legitimate. I half expected to find it was some elaborate deception." "Disappointed?" I asked, only half joking. "Confused," she corrected. "If you've had all this success, all this financial security, why stay with us all these years? Why raise Thomas and Mary when Felicia left? You could have had freedom, travel, a completely different life." The question revealed so much about how Beth viewed the world, as though money automatically meant escape from family obligation, as though wealth and familial commitment were somehow mutually exclusive. "I stayed because I loved you," I said, simply. "I raised Thomas and Mary because they needed someone to love them consistently, and you needed support to build your career. Money doesn't change those fundamental human needs, for connection, for belonging, for purpose." Beth shook her head, still struggling to reconcile her understanding of motivation with my choices. "But surely there were moments when you resented it? When you wished you could just leave and enjoy your success?" "Of course there were difficult moments," I acknowledged. "Raising children is challenging under the best circumstances. But I never viewed it as a burden I was waiting to escape. Family isn't something to endure until you can afford to walk away from it, Beth." She flinched slightly at that. Perhaps, recognizing her own philosophy reflected back at her. And yet, here you are, walking away. "I'm not walking away from family," I corrected. "I'm walking away from disrespect. There's a significant difference." Beth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the folder. "The lease agreement Ron sent over. It's triple what we've been paying. That's market rate for a house of that size in that neighborhood, I confirmed. We can't afford it, she admitted, the words clearly difficult for her. Not with Drew's business struggling and my partnership still not finalized. I'd suspected as much, but had wanted Beth to acknowledge it directly. What do you propose? Beth straightened, shifting into the professional demeanor that had always been her armor. I've prepared a counteroffer. We can increase our current payment by 15%, which is the maximum our budget can accommodate right now. In exchange, I'm willing to formalize your right to the master suite in the house. No more basement, no more guest room, a permanent, appropriate living space. I considered her offer, noting what it revealed about her thinking. Even now, faced with the reality of my financial independence, she still assumed I might want to return to the house, to a life defined by her terms and conditions. That's a generous offer, I said carefully, but I won't be returning to live in that house. This is my home now. Beth's professional mask slipped, genuine surprise showing through. But it would be so much more practical. The cost of maintaining this place alone is well within my means, I finished for her. Beth, I'm not looking for practical arrangements or financial considerations. I'm looking for respect and genuine connection. And you don't think you can have that if we live together, she said, her tone flat. I think, I said gently, that we both need to relearn how to relate to each other outside of the roles we've been playing for so long. You need to see me as more than a convenient caregiver, and I need to practice asserting my own needs and identity. Beth closed the folder slowly, seeming to accept that her negotiation strategy had failed. So what happens with the house? Are you evicting us? No, I said. I'm offering you a choice. You can continue living there at your current payment rate for 1 year, provided we agree to certain conditions. Her eyebrows rose. What conditions? Weekly family dinners here at my house. Real conversations, not just progress reports on your career. And therapy, both individual for you and joint sessions for us together. Beth stiffened. Therapy? I don't need. This isn't negotiable, Beth, I interrupted firmly. If you want to stay in the house under the current financial arrangements, these are my terms. The silence stretched between us, heavy with decades of unspoken truths and misaligned expectations. Finally, Beth nodded, a single sharp movement that spoke more of capitulation than agreement. Fine. Dinner and therapy. For 1 year. It wasn't quite the reconnection I had hoped for, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of assumptions, and patterns that had defined our relationship for too long. As Beth gathered her things to leave, she paused at the door, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. The house really is lovely, Mom. It suits you. Coming from Beth, it was practically an effusive compliment. I smiled, accepting it for the small peace offering it was. Thank you. I think so too. The first family dinner under our new arrangement arrived the following Sunday. I spent the afternoon preparing Donald's old recipes, pot roast with root vegetables, homemade rolls, and apple cobbler for dessert. It was the menu I had made countless times when Beth was growing up, comfort food that had once bridged the gaps between us during those difficult years after her father died. As I set the dining room table with my grandmother's china, now displayed proudly in a cherry hutch rather than packed away in storage, I found myself unexpectedly nervous. This wasn't simply a meal. It was the first step in rebuilding a relationship that had crumbled under the weight of unspoken truths and misaligned expectations. The doorbell rang precisely at 5 o'clock. Beth's punctuality had always been a point of pride for her. Welcome, I said, opening the door to find my daughter and son-in-law standing stiffly on the porch. Beth held a bottle of wine, Drew a bouquet of flowers, both offerings carrying the formal air of guests visiting an acquaintance rather than family coming home. These are for you, Beth said, handing me the wine with an awkward half-smile. I wasn't sure what you'd be serving. Thank you, it's perfect, I assured her, ushering them into the foyer. Thomas and Mary should be here shortly. Drew glanced around the house with undisguised curiosity. This place is really something, Norma Jean. The woodwork alone must have cost a fortune to restore. I caught Beth shooting him a warning look. Our recent conversations about reducing everything to financial terms evidently fresh in her mind. It's been lovingly maintained over the years, I replied, choosing to take his comment at face value. The previous owners were historical preservation enthusiasts. We moved to the living room. The conversation stilted as we navigated this new terrain. Beth perched on the edge of the settee, as if afraid to fully commit her weight to it, her eyes constantly roving the room, cataloging details. "Your office called to confirm our first therapy appointment," she said abruptly. "Thursday at 4. I nodded, appreciating that she'd followed through despite her obvious discomfort with the idea. "Yes, Dr. Lambert comes highly recommended. She specializes in family dynamics and intergenerational issues." Beth's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. "I still think this is unnecessary. We can resolve our issues without paying someone to listen to us talk. If we could resolve them, through conversation alone, we would have done so years ago," I pointed out gently. "Sometimes an objective perspective helps." Beth opened her mouth to argue further when the doorbell rang again, heralding Thomas and Mary's arrival. The tension in the room immediately dissipated as my grandchildren entered with the easy warmth that had always characterized their relationship with me. "Grandma, this place looks amazing," Mary exclaimed, hugging me tightly before presenting me with a small potted orchid. "A housewarming gift for your windowsill." Thomas followed with a warm embrace. "Something smells incredible. Please tell me it's your pot roast." "With extra carrots, just how you like it," I confirmed, leading everyone to the dining room where the table was set and waiting. As we settled around the table, I watched Beth take in the familiar comfort food, the family china, the careful attention to everyone's preferences, Thomas's extra carrots, Drew's gravy in a separate boat since he preferred less, Mary's rolls placed closest to her as they had always been her favorite. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in her eyes, perhaps an acknowledgement of the care that had always infused these meals, a care that had nothing to do with financial provision and everything to do with attention and love. "This is just like when we were kids," Thomas said appreciatively, serving himself a generous portion. "Sunday dinner at Grandma's table." "Except we're in a completely different house," Beth pointed out, her tone more puzzled than critical. "Yet somehow, it feels the same." "That's because Grandma brings home with her wherever she goes," Mary said simply, reaching for a roll. "It's not about the building. It's about who's gathering us together." The observation landed in the center of the table like a gentle revelation. Beth looked at me with new consideration, as if seeing some dimension of my role in the family that had previously escaped her notice. The meal progressed more comfortably after that, with Thomas and Mary sharing stories from their week, Drew discussing a new client project, and even Beth gradually relaxing enough to describe an amusing incident from court. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkward silence, careful avoidance of sensitive topics, but it was a beginning. As I served the apple cobbler, Beth suddenly asked, "Do you remember making this after Dad died?" "I think you made it every Sunday for months." I nodded, surprised she had retained this detail. "It was his favorite. Making it felt like keeping a piece of him with us." "I never knew that," Beth said quietly. "I just thought you made it because I liked it." "You did like it," I confirmed. "But it was also my way of processing grief, of holding on to Donald's memory while trying to move forward. Many of the things I did during that time served multiple purposes, practical needs interwoven with emotional ones." Beth considered this, absently tracing the rim of her dessert plate with one finger. "I think I missed a lot of those layers. I saw the practical actions, the extra jobs, the careful budgeting, but not the emotional undercurrents. We were both doing our best in an impossible situation," I offered. You were a teenager who'd lost her father. I was a widow trying to hold our world together. A silence settled over the table, not uncomfortable so much as contemplative. Finally, Mary spoke up. Maybe that's where the therapy could help, understanding those different layers of experience that got lost in translation. Beth didn't immediately reject the suggestion as she might have days earlier. Instead, she nodded slowly. Perhaps. After dinner, as Beth and Drew prepared to leave, Beth lingered in the foyer, examining a small bronze sculpture displayed on the entry table. This is lovely, she commented. New acquisition? Actually, it's quite old, I explained. I purchased it at an estate sale nearly 30 years ago for $75. It's a Bergman, an Austrian sculptor known for his detailed cold-painted bronzes. It's worth considerably more now. Beth's eyebrows rose. How much more? I smiled, recognizing the flicker of her characteristic financial curiosity. The most recent comparable piece sold at auction for just over $20,000. Drew whistled softly. You really do have an eye for value. Not just financial value, I clarified. I bought it because it spoke to me. The detail, the artistry, the quiet dignity of it. The appreciation in worth was a fortunate side effect, not the primary purpose. Beth studied the piece with new interest. You've tried to tell me this for years, haven't you? That value isn't always measured in dollars. That some things matter simply because they matter to us. Yes, I acknowledged, touched by this moment of insight. Though I probably should have been more direct about it rather than hoping you'd absorb the lesson through observation. Beth met my gaze directly, something vulnerable flickering behind her usual composure. I'm not sure I would have heard it, even if you'd said it explicitly. Some lessons take longer to learn than others. It was the most honest exchange we'd had in years, perhaps ever. As they stepped out onto the porch, Beth turned back unexpectedly. Dinner was nice, she said, the simplicity of the statement somehow making it more genuine. Thank you. Same time next week? I asked. Beth nodded, a small but significant commitment. We'll be here. As I closed the door behind them, I felt a cautious optimism taking root. The gulf between us remained substantial, decades of misunderstanding and hurt not easily bridged in a single evening. But for the first time in years, I could glimpse a pathway forward, narrow and uncertain, but present nonetheless. Later that evening, as I sat in my reading nook with a cup of tea, I reflected on how drastically my life had changed in just a few short weeks. From the damp basement to this beautiful home, from silent acceptance to honest confrontation, from invisibility to recognition. The transformation wasn't just in my living situation, but in how I was choosing to exist in the world, no longer subordinating my needs and identity to others, no longer hiding my accomplishments or diminishing my worth. It had taken 73 years, but I was finally learning that standing in my truth didn't mean losing my family. It meant giving them the opportunity to know me fully, to relate to me honestly, and perhaps, in time, to value me for reasons that had nothing to do with what I could provide and everything to do with who I was. Thursday arrived with a steady, autumn rain, the kind that seemed to whisper secrets as it tapped against the windows of my new home. I spent the morning at Second Chances, reviewing inventory with Norma Jean and finalizing plans for an estate auction we'd be handling the following month. Nervous about the therapy session? Norma Jean asked as we cataloged a recently acquired collection of Victorian silverware. A bit, I admitted, carefully wrapping a fish server in acid-free tissue. Beth and I have perfected the art of talking around issues rather than about them. Having a third party force us into honesty will be uncomfortable, Norma Jean smiled. Knowingly. Uncomfortable is where the growth happens. Besides, you've already done the hardest part, standing up for yourself and revealing the truth. Have I, though? I mused, setting the wrapped piece in its storage box. Sometimes I wonder if I've just traded one form of avoidance for another. Instead of hiding my financial success to maintain peace, I'm using it as leverage to force a relationship reset. That's not avoidance, Norma Jean countered. That's strategy. You're using the resources you have to create circumstances where healing might be possible. Her framing gave me pause. I hadn't thought of my actions as strategic so much as reactive, a long overdue response to Beth's dismissal. But looking at the situation more objectively, I could see a deliberate architecture to my choices. Purchasing a home that established my independence while remaining close enough for regular contact. Requiring therapy as a condition of the housing arrangement. Creating weekly dinners to re-establish familial bonds outside the caregiving context that had defined our relationship for decades. I suppose you're right, I acknowledged. Though, I'm not sure Beth would appreciate being managed quite so deliberately. She managed you into a basement, Norma Jean reminded me bluntly, and would have kept you there indefinitely if circumstances hadn't forced a change. Sometimes people need a structural realignment before their perspective can shift. When I arrived at Dr. Lambert's office that afternoon, Beth was already there, sitting rigidly in the waiting room, scrolling through emails on her phone with sharp, efficient movements of her thumb. She glanced up as I entered, her expression carefully neutral. "You're 3 minutes early," she noted, as if this was significant information. "So are you," I pointed out, settling into the chair beside her. A faint smile touched her lips. Punctuality was one of the few traits we share. One of many, actually, I corrected gently, though we've both spent years focusing on our differences rather than our similarities. Before Beth could respond, the office door opened and Dr. Lambert appeared, a woman perhaps in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and intelligent eyes behind simple tortoiseshell glasses. "Mrs. Wilson? Ms. Harrington? I'm Dr. Lambert. Please come in." The therapy room was comfortable without being ostentatious. Soft seating arranged to facilitate conversation, warm lighting, a notable absence of the clinical feel that characterized many professional spaces. Beth and I took seats on opposite ends of a small sofa, the cushion between us like a demilitarized zone. "Before we begin," Dr. Lambert said, settling into her chair, "I want to acknowledge that family therapy can be challenging. We often come into these spaces with long-established patterns of communication and deeply held assumptions about one another. My role is not to take sides or assign blame, but to help you both recognize those patterns and develop healthier ways of relating." Beth shifted slightly, her discomfort evident in the way she smoothed her already impeccable slacks. "I want to be clear that I'm here as a condition of our housing arrangement. I don't personally believe therapy is necessary to resolve our disagreement." Dr. Lambert nodded, neither validating nor challenging Beth's position. "Understood. Many people come to therapy reluctantly at first. What matters is that you're here." She turned to me. "And you, Mrs. Wilson? What brings you to therapy today?" I considered the question carefully. Hope, I suppose. Hope that Beth and I might develop a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine understanding, rather than obligation and assumed roles. "That's a beautiful aspiration," Dr. Lambert acknowledged. "For today, I'd like to understand more about your family history and current dynamics. Perhaps we could start with each of you describing how you view your relationship." What followed was 90 minutes of careful excavation, Beth and I each recounting our perspectives on pivotal moments in our shared history, Dr. Lambert gently guiding us away from accusation and toward deeper understanding. We covered Donald's death, Beth's early career struggles, my role in raising Thomas and Mary, and finally, the basement incident that had catalyzed our current situation. "So, to summarize," Dr. Lambert said thoughtfully, "Norma Jean, you've spent decades prioritizing Beth's needs and those of her children, often at the expense of your own identity and recognition. Meanwhile, Beth, you've built your life around financial achievement and professional success, measuring your worth and, by extension, the worth of others, primarily through economic contribution. Beth started to protest, then stopped herself, seemingly recognizing the truth in the assessment. That's not entirely inaccurate, she admitted reluctantly. The issue, Dr. Lambert continued, appears to be not just about the basement itself, but about what it represented, a fundamental devaluing of Norma Jean's non-financial contributions to your family. Beth's jaw tightened. I never said her contributions weren't valuable. No, I agreed quietly. You didn't say it. You demonstrated it through your actions, relegating me to the basement, excluding me from your professional gatherings, discussing me as a burden rather than a partner in raising your children. And now you're using your financial position to force me into therapy and family dinners, Beth countered, a flash of her old defensiveness returning. How is that any different? Dr. Lambert held up a hand, gently interrupting what might have escalated into familiar territory. This is actually an important point to explore. Beth, do you feel that your mother is now using financial leverage in the same way you've been accused of doing? Beth hesitated, clearly weighing her words. Yes and no. Yes, she's using her financial position to establish new rules for our relationship. But no, it's not the same because… She paused, seeming to surprise herself with her next thought. Because she's not devaluing me as a person. She's not saying I'm only worth what I can contribute financially. She's saying our relationship needs to change, not that I'm not worth having a relationship with at all. The distinction seemed to catch Beth off guard, as if she'd only just realized it herself. Dr. Lambert nodded encouragingly. That's a significant insight, Beth. Norma Jean, would you agree with that assessment? Completely, I said, genuinely, moved by Beth's moment of clarity. I've never questioned your worth as a person, Beth. Even when I was most hurt by your actions, it was because I valued our relationship so deeply, not because I was measuring your value by how you treated me. Dr. Lambert glanced at the clock. We're nearing the end of our time, but I think you've both taken an important step today. For our next session, I'd like you to pay attention to the ways you each measure value in your daily lives. What you prioritize, what you notice, what you dismiss as unimportant. Becoming aware of these automatic assessments can help us understand why you've had such different perspectives on the same family experiences. As we gathered our belongings, Beth turned to me with an unexpected question. Would you like to get coffee? There's a place around the corner that's supposed to be good. The invitation caught me by surprise, a small but significant departure from our usual pattern of minimal interaction outside obligatory family functions. I'd like that, I said simply. The cafe was cozy and quiet, with raindrops creating shifting patterns on the windows as we settled at a small table with our drinks, a latte for Beth, Earl Grey tea for me. That was harder than I expected, Beth admitted, wrapping her hands around her cup as if drawing warmth from it. Honesty usually is, I agreed, especially when it challenges how we've seen ourselves. Beth studied me over the rim of her coffee. Is that why you hid your financial success for so long? Because the truth would challenge how we saw each other? The question was insightful, touching on something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. Partly, I acknowledged. But it was also about wanting to be valued for who I was, not what. I was afraid that if you knew about the money, it would become the only reason you wanted me in your life. And now you're afraid it's the only reason I'm sitting here having coffee with you, Beth said, displaying a perceptiveness that reminded me she was, indeed, my daughter. The thought has crossed my mind, I admitted. Beth was quiet for a moment, turning her cup slowly between her hands. I've been thinking about what you said, about how I measure everything in financial terms. I'm not sure I know how to value things any other way. It's how I've structured my entire life, my whole worldview. It's never too late to expand that perspective, I said gently. Value comes in countless forms: emotional support, shared history, wisdom, companionship, loyalty. None of these have price tags, yet they're what make life meaningful. You tried to teach me that through your actions, Beth said quietly. I just wasn't paying attention. And I should have been more explicit, I countered. We both made mistakes, Beth. The question is whether we're willing to learn from them now. As the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, I felt something shift between us, not a complete transformation, but perhaps the first small crack in the wall of misunderstanding that had separated us for too long. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, nor was it resolution, but it was something equally precious: the beginning of possibility. When we finally parted ways outside the cafe, Beth hesitated, then said with careful deliberation, I'll see you Sunday. Then, for dinner. Sunday, I agreed, recognizing the simple statement for what it was. Not just an acknowledgement of our arrangement, but a small step toward the relationship we might yet build. The first real test of our fragile new equilibrium came unexpectedly the following week. I was arranging a display of Art Deco jewelry for an upcoming exhibition at Second Chances when the shop bell chimed. Looking up, I was surprised to see Ronald Donald, Beth's managing partner and the guest of honor at the infamous dinner party that had preceded my basement exile. Mrs. Wilson? He inquired, approaching the counter with the confident stride of someone accustomed to commanding attention. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, I replied, carefully setting down the diamond and onyx bracelet I'd been examining. How can I help you? He glanced around the shop with appreciative interest. Remarkable collection you have here. Beth mentioned you run this place, but I had no idea it was so extensive. I noted his careful choice of words, not quaint or charming, as people often described antique shops, but extensive, acknowledging the scope and value of the inventory. Thank you, I said. We specialize in museum-quality pieces and rare collections. Are you interested in antiques, Mr. Donald? Ronald, please, he insisted with a practiced smile. And yes, particularly Art Nouveau silver. My wife and I have been collecting for years. We fell into an easy conversation about silver hallmarks and design periods, his knowledge surprisingly substantial for someone who had ostensibly just stopped by on a whim. As we talked, I became increasingly certain that this visit had a purpose beyond casual interest. While I'm enjoying our discussion immensely, I said eventually, I suspect you didn't come here just to talk about silver patterns. Ronald's smile shifted, becoming more genuine and less polished. Beth always said you were perceptive. You're right, of course. He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. Beth has been different these past few weeks. More reflective, less driven by the next achievement. When I inquired about the change, she mentioned your recent rearrangement of circumstances. That's one way to put it, I acknowledged, curious about how much Beth had shared with him. She told me everything, he admitted. About the basement, about your financial revelation, about the therapy sessions. He shook his head, something like admiration in his expression. I have to say, Mrs. Wilson, it's quite extraordinary, both your business acumen and your restraint in not revealing it sooner. It wasn't restraint so much as misplaced consideration, I clarified. But what brings you here to discuss this? With me? Ronald straightened, his demeanor shifting subtly from conversational to professional. Beth is exceptionally valuable to our firm. Her analytical mind, her work ethic, they're unparalleled. But lately, I've noticed something else, a developing awareness of the human element in our work. I raised an eyebrow, encouraging him to continue. Last week, she advocated for a pro bono case, a family facing eviction after the breadwinner suffered a workplace injury. It's not the kind of case we typically handle, and certainly not the type Beth would have championed in the past. And you attribute this change to our recent discussions? Ronald nodded. She mentioned something about reconsidering how value is measured, that some contributions can't be calculated in billable hours. A small warmth kindled in my chest at the thought that Beth might truly be integrating our conversations into her worldview. And this concerns you? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. On the contrary, he replied, it makes her more effective, not less. Law isn't just about statutes and precedents, it's about people. Beth's developing empathy makes her a more complete attorney. He paused before adding, that's why I've decided to recommend her for full partnership, effective immediately, rather than waiting until next quarter as originally planned. The news was unexpected, a professional acknowledgement of personal growth that Beth would surely value deeply. That's very generous of you. It's not generosity. It's recognition of excellence, Ronald corrected. Excellence that seems to run in the family, judging by what I've seen here. He gestured around the shop. I came today partly out of curiosity about the woman who raised such a formidable daughter, and partly to extend an invitation. An invitation? The firm is hosting a charity gala next month benefiting legal aid for families facing housing insecurity. Beth suggested you might be willing to lend your expertise in fine art and antiques to the auction committee. The request represented something significant, not just external validation of my professional acumen, but Beth actively creating an opportunity for me to be seen and valued in her professional sphere, the very arena from which she had previously excluded me. I'd be happy to help, I said sincerely. Excellent, Ronald replied with evident satisfaction. The committee meets Wednesdays at the firm. Beth can provide the details. He glanced at his watch. I should be getting back. It was a pleasure meeting you properly, Mrs. Wilson. I suspect. Our dinner conversation would have been far more interesting had you been included. After he left, I stood by the counter for a long moment, processing the interaction. It wasn't just the professional recognition that moved me, though that was certainly gratifying. It was the realization that Beth had spoken about me to her colleagues, not as a burden or an obligation, but as someone with value to contribute, someone worth knowing. External validation had never been my primary goal in confronting Beth about her treatment of me. Yet there was something powerfully affirming about being seen, truly seen, not just by my daughter, but by the wider world she inhabited. That evening, my phone chimed with a text from Beth. Ronald said he stopped by your shop. Hope that wasn't too awkward. He's been insistent about meeting you properly since I mentioned your expertise. I smiled at the message, not just at its content, but at the fact that Beth had reached out unprompted, creating a connection beyond our structured Sunday dinners and Thursday therapy sessions. Not awkward at all, I replied. He mentioned a charity auction committee. Beth's response came quickly. Only if you're interested, no pressure. The disclaimer was new, a small acknowledgement that my time and choices deserved respect rather than assumption. Another tiny step forward in our evolving relationship. I'd like to be involved, I wrote back. Looking forward to Sunday dinner. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm of cautious progress, therapy sessions that ventured into increasingly vulnerable territory, Sunday dinners where conversation flowed more naturally, committee meetings for the upcoming charity auction where Beth and I discovered a surprising synchronicity in our professional approaches. While our relationship remained fragile, constructed of tentative bridges over decades of misunderstanding, each small interaction seemed to strengthen these new connections. Then, on a crisp November morning, everything threatened to unravel, with a single phone call. Mom? Mary's voice was tight with concern. Have you talked to Mom today? I was at Second Chances preparing for a private showing with an important collector. Not since our committee meeting yesterday. Why? Mary hesitated. She just called me, really upset. Apparently, Felicia is back in town. The name landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of tension through my body. Felicia, Beth's younger sister Thomas and Mary's biological mother, the woman who had walked away from her infant and toddler 25 years ago to find herself in Europe and never returned. Back? I echoed, my mind racing to process the implications. Did she say why? Something about reconnecting with family, Mary said, her tone making it clear how she felt about this sudden desire for connection after decades of absence. Mom said she's staying at the Westfield Hotel downtown. She wants to meet us, all of us, for dinner tomorrow night. I closed my eyes briefly, steeling myself against the complicated emotions Felicia's return evoked. How do you feel about that? Honestly, I don't know, Mary admitted. Thomas is furious, says he won't go. But Mom is insisting we should at least hear Felicia out. The fact that Beth wanted this meeting surprised me. Despite Felicia being her sister, Beth had been deeply hurt by her abandonment of Thomas and Mary. She had rarely spoken of Felicia over the years, and when she did, it was with a cold dismissal that suggested the wound remained unhealed. I'll call your mother, I promised. Try not to worry too much until we know more. After ending the call with Mary, I tried Beth's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Unusual for her, Beth prided herself on accessibility, especially during business hours. Something about this situation had disrupted her carefully maintained professional boundaries. Rather than leave a message, I decided to go to her directly. I closed the shop early, apologizing to Norma John for the short notice, and drove to Beth's law firm downtown. The receptionist recognized me from the auction. Committee meetings. Mrs. Wilson? Beth's in her office, but she asked not to be disturbed. She has a visitor. A chill of premonition ran through me. This visitor, is it a woman, about 50, with dark hair? The receptionist's surprised expression confirmed my suspicion. Yes, they've been in there about an hour. Should I let Beth know you're here? Please, I said, settling into one of the waiting area chairs with outward calm that belied my inner turmoil. 10 minutes later, Beth's office door opened. She emerged alone, her professional mask firmly in place, though I could detect the subtle signs of strain around her eyes. Mom, she said, clearly surprised despite the receptionist's message. What are you doing here? Mary called me about Felicia, I explained simply. I was concerned. Beth glanced back toward her closed office door. She's actually here now. We've been catching up. The careful neutrality in her tone told me nothing about her emotional state. I see. And how do you feel about that? Beth's composure wavered slightly. Could we discuss this somewhere else? Maybe the coffee shop downstairs? Once settled at a corner table, cups of untouched coffee between us, Beth's professional veneer began to crack. She looks the same, she said quietly, almost to herself. 25 years and she barely looks older. Still beautiful, still charming, still absolutely convinced that her choices are justified. I reached across the table to cover Beth's hand with mine. What did she want? To reconnect, Beth said, an edge of bitterness creeping into her voice. Apparently, she's had a spiritual awakening and wants to make amends with her family. She says she regrets missing Thomas and Mary's childhoods. That's convenient timing, I observed carefully. Beth's gaze sharpened. Exactly. 25 years of silence, and suddenly she reappears just weeks after you reveal your financial situation? I may not be as perceptive about people as you are, Mom, but even I can see the connection. So Beth had drawn the same conclusion I had, that news of my fortune had somehow reached Felicia, prompting this sudden desire for family reconciliation. What does she know about my situation? I asked. Everything, Beth admitted with a grimace. She mentioned it within the first 5 minutes. How proud she was to hear about your late-in-life success. She must have been keeping tabs on us somehow all these years. Social media makes that easy enough, I pointed out. And your recent Partnership announcement was in the legal journals. Beth nodded wearily. She wants to meet everyone for dinner tomorrow night. She specifically asked if you would be there. And you said yes? I said I'd ask, Beth clarified. I know how you must feel about her mom, after what she did to Thomas and Mary. What about how you feel? I interrupted gently. Felicia abandoned your children, yes, but she also abandoned you. She left you to raise a toddler and an infant alone while building your career. That's not something easily forgiven. Beth's eyes shimmered with unexpected tears. I was so angry with her for so long. But now, I don't know. Part of me wants to hear what she has to say. Another part wants to slam the door in her face. It was perhaps the most honest expression of vulnerability I'd heard from Beth in years. The therapy was working, slowly creating space for her to acknowledge complex emotions rather than reducing everything to practical considerations. What about Thomas and Mary? I asked. How do they feel about this reunion? Mary's cautiously open to it. Thomas refuses to even discuss it, Beth said, wiping discreetly at her eyes. I don't want to force him, but I also don't want him to regret not taking this opportunity. Opportunity for what, though? I pressed gently. What are you hoping might come from this meeting? Beth was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with uncharacteristic patience. Closure, maybe, she finally said. Or at least answers. Felicia never explained why she left. Not really. Just vague talk about feeling trapped and needing to find herself. And what if her answers don't provide the closure you're hoping for? Then at least we tried, Beth said with a small shrug. That didn't quite disguise the weight of her expectations. Isn't that what all this therapy has been about? Honesty and facing difficult truths? I couldn't argue with that logic, even as concern gnawed at me. Felicia had always been charming and persuasive, qualities that had allowed her to leave devastating damage in her wake while somehow maintaining others' goodwill. I worried about the emotional toll this reunion might take on my family, particularly Thomas and Mary, who had built lives defined by Felicia's absence rather than her presence. If you want me there tomorrow night, I'll come, I said finally. But only if Thomas is willing to attend as well. This needs to be a family decision, with everyone's feelings considered equally. Beth nodded, seeming to draw strength from my conditions. I'll talk to him again. Maybe you could too. He's always listened to you. I'll try, I promised, though without much optimism. Thomas had inherited his mother's stubborn streak, albeit channeled toward protecting those he loved rather than advancing his career. As Beth returned to her office where Felicia waited, I remained at the coffee shop, my mind turning over possible scenarios for tomorrow's dinner. Whatever Felicia's true motives, her return had already disrupted the delicate new balance we had been building. Whether that disruption would strengthen our family bonds or fracture them anew remained to be seen. Thomas answered his door on the third knock, his expression shifting from annoyance to resignation when he saw me standing on his apartment threshold. Mom sent you to convince me to come to dinner, didn't she? He asked, stepping aside to let me in. She suggested I might talk to you, I acknowledged, following him into his modestly furnished living room. But I'm not here to convince you of anything. Thomas gave me a skeptical look as he dropped onto his sofa. Right, you're just stopping by at 7 on a weeknight for no particular reason. I settled into an armchair across from him, taking in the scattered textbooks and laptop, evidence of his graduate studies in social work. I'm here because I care about you, and this situation is difficult. I wanted to check how you're really doing with it all. His defensive posture softened slightly. I'm fine. I just don't see the point in meeting someone who didn't want to know me for 25 years. That's a completely valid position, I assured him. You don't owe Felicia your time or attention. Thomas blinked, clearly surprised by my response. So you're not going to tell me I should go for closure or family harmony or whatever? No, I said simply. Those might be reasons why others want to meet with Felicia, but they're not obligations for you. He studied me for a moment, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. What do you think about all this, Grandma? About Felicia suddenly coming back? I chose my words carefully, respecting Thomas's emotional intelligence while being honest about my concerns. I think Felicia's timing is suspicious. She reappears just when news of my financial situation might have reached her. That suggests motivations beyond simple reconciliation. Exactly, Thomas exclaimed, gesturing emphatically. She abandoned us, ignored us for decades, and now suddenly wants to be part of the family? It's obvious she's after money. Perhaps, I conceded. But people are complex, Thomas. Even selfish actions can be driven by multiple motivations. Felicia may well have genuine regrets alongside financial interests. Thomas fell silent, his expression troubled. Finally, he asked quietly, "Do you think I should go? Not for her sake, but for Mom's? For Mary's?" The question revealed much about Thomas, his consideration for others, his willingness to endure discomfort for their benefit. These were qualities I had tried to nurture in him throughout his childhood, and seeing them now filled me with quiet pride. "I think your presence would provide support for your mother and sister," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean you should go if it would be too painful for you. Your well-being matters too." Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his mother that it made my heart ache. "Will you be there?" "If you decide to go, yes," I promised. "I wouldn't leave you to face this alone." Something in my phrasing seemed to resonate with him. "Like you didn't leave me alone when I was little, when she left." "Never," I confirmed softly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "Okay, I'll go, but I'm not pretending this is some happy family reunion. I'm going to support Mom and Mary, and because you'll be there." The next evening found us gathered in a private dining room at the Westfield Hotel, an awkward tableau of family tension barely masked by polite conversation. Beth sat rigidly beside me, Mary beside Thomas across the table. The fifth chair remained conspicuously empty. "She's late," Beth observed, checking her watch for perhaps the fifth time in 10 minutes. Some things never change. Just as the words left her mouth, the door opened and Felicia swept in, still striking at 50, her dark hair now artfully streaked with silver, her movements carrying the same careless grace I remembered from decades earlier. "Beth, darling, I'm so sorry to keep you waiting," she exclaimed, bending to kiss her sister's cheek before Beth could react. Traffic was absolutely dreadful. Her gaze traveled around the table, lingering first on Thomas and Mary with an expression of theatrical wonder. "My beautiful children," she breathed, pressing a hand to her heart. "Look how you've grown." Neither Thomas nor Mary made any move to stand or embrace her. After an awkward moment, Felicia's attention shifted to me, her smile never faltering. "Norma Jean, you look marvelous. Wealth clearly agrees with you." The blunt reference to money within the first 30 seconds confirmed my suspicions about Felicia's priorities. I nodded politely but offered no embrace. "Hello, Felicia. It's been a long time." She settled into the empty chair with a graceful flourish. "Too long, I know. But I'm here now, and so eager to reconnect with all of you." What followed was a carefully choreographed performance on Felicia's part, wistful references to mist, milestones, vague allusions to her journey of self-discovery across Europe, and repeated assurances of how often she had thought of her family during her absence. "I always meant to come back sooner," she insisted, dabbing at dry eyes with her napkin. "But the timing never seemed right. And then years passed, and I worried you might not want to see me after so long." "Yet here you are now," Thomas observed, his tone neutral but pointed. "What changed?" Felicia's smile faltered slightly before regaining its wattage. "I've been doing a lot of spiritual work in recent years. Meditation, reflection on past mistakes, that sort of thing. I realized I needed to make amends for the pain I've caused. That's a laudable goal, I said mildly. Though amends typically involve some form of restitution, not just apologies. A flicker of calculation crossed Felicia's face. Of course. I don't expect forgiveness to come easily or instantly. I know I have much to make up for. 25 years is a lot to make up for, Mary said quietly, speaking for the first time since Felicia's arrival. Felicia reached across the table as if to take Mary's hand, but my granddaughter subtly shifted away from the contact. I know, darling, I've missed so much. Your childhood, your accomplishments. I'll never get those years back. It's my greatest regret. The conversation meandered through dinner, Felicia skillfully deflecting direct questions about her life while mining for details about ours. She seemed particularly interested in my antique business and the upcoming charity auction. I've always had an eye for beautiful things, she commented, swirling her wine. Perhaps I could help with the auction selections? I spent several years working with galleries in Paris. Beth exchanged a glance with me, clearly recognizing Felicia's transparent attempt to insert herself into our financial sphere. The committee is already finalized, she said firmly, but thank you for the offer. As dessert was served, Felicia finally arrived at what seemed to be her true purpose. I've been thinking, she said, setting down her fork with deliberate care, that perhaps it's time for me to settle down, to be closer to family. Closer? Thomas echoed skeptically. Yes, Felicia continued, her enthusiasm undimmed by the chilly reception. I've been looking at apartments locally. Nothing fancy, just a small place where I could establish roots. Somewhere to host Sunday, dinners perhaps, to make up for lost time. The parallel to our newly established family tradition was not lost on any of us. Beth's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. That's a significant change from your previous lifestyle, I observed. What will you do for income? Felicia's smile flickered again before brightening. Well, that's part of what I wanted to discuss. I was hoping, given your connections and success, Norma Jean, that you might have some insights about opportunities in the antique business. Or perhaps there might be a role for me at your shop? Family helping family, you know. And there it was, the request for financial support thinly veiled as a desire for connection. Before I could respond, Thomas pushed back his chair, the scrape against the floor cutting through the carefully maintained veneer of civility. Unbelievable, he said, shaking his head. You abandon your own children for 25 years, then waltz back and immediately ask for a job? For money? Felicia's practiced smile faltered as she turned to Thomas. Darling, you misunderstand. I'm not asking for handouts. I genuinely want to rebuild our relationship. While conveniently securing financial support in the process, Thomas interrupted, his voice controlled but vibrating with emotion. Let's be honest about what's happening here. Beth placed a restraining hand on Thomas's arm. Thomas, please. No, Mom, he said firmly. We need to address this directly. Felicia didn't reach out when I graduated high school, or when Mary got into nursing school, or during any significant moment of our lives. She reached out when she heard Grandma had money. That's not coincidence, that's calculation. Felicia's expression shifted from conciliatory to defensive. That's unfair. My timing might seem convenient, but I've been working toward this reunion for years. The news about Norma Jean's success just gave me the final push I needed. The final push? Mary echoed quietly. Because knowing your children were growing up without you wasn't push enough? A tense silence fell over the table. I watched the dynamics unfold, noting how Beth sat slightly straighter, positioning herself between her children and her sister, as if still trying to shield them from potential hurt. Perhaps, I said carefully, we should acknowledge the reality of our situation. Felicia, you left your children when they were very young. Whatever your reasons, that choice had profound consequences for everyone at this table. Beth had to balance her career with unexpected single parenthood. I postponed retirement to help raise Thomas and Mary. And most significantly, Your children grew up without their mother. Felicia's eyes narrowed slightly. I'm well aware of what I did, Norma Jean. I don't need you to enumerate my failures. I'm not listing failures, I corrected gently. I'm establishing context for our current interaction. You've returned after a long absence with what appears to be a financial agenda. That creates understandable suspicion about your motives. So that's it? Felicia demanded, her charm evaporating. You've all decided I'm just here for money, so there's no point in even trying to reconnect. Beth finally spoke, her voice steady, despite the emotion clearly simmering beneath the surface. No one's saying reconnection is impossible, Felicia, but it requires honesty about your past choices, your present circumstances, and your future intentions. It requires acknowledging the harm you caused without defensiveness. Most importantly, it requires respecting boundaries. Felicia's gaze darted between us, perhaps realizing for the first time that she faced a united front. Whatever vulnerabilities she had hoped to exploit no longer existed. Not in Beth, who had learned to value emotional connections alongside financial success. Not in Thomas and Mary, who had grown into confident adults secure in their worth. And certainly not in me, who had finally stepped fully into my own power. What boundaries would those be? She asked cautiously. Beth exchanged glances with her children, then looked at me before turning back to her sister. No financial entanglements. No job at Mom's shop. No expectations of immediate forgiveness or trust. If you genuinely want to rebuild relationships, it starts with proving your sincerity through consistent presence and respect, not through asking for opportunities or financial support. Felicia's expression hardened, the mask of familial devotion, slipping to reveal the calculation beneath. I see you've all made up your minds about me. No, I said firmly. We've simply made up our minds about what we need and deserve in our relationships. The question is whether you're willing to meet us there. Felicia left the restaurant that night with vague promises to think about everything and be in touch soon. None of us were surprised when weeks passed without any contact. Whatever reunion she had envisioned, it clearly didn't align with the boundaries Beth had established. As December arrived, bringing with it the first snowfall of the season, I found myself settling into a new rhythm of life, one defined by choice, rather than obligation, by mutual respect, rather than unspoken expectations. The Victorian on Maple Street had become truly mine, filled with treasures I'd collected over decades but never displayed, warmed by regular visits from Thomas and Mary, and increasingly, from Beth as well. Our weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Lambert continued, each one peeling back another layer of misunderstanding and assumption that had calcified between us over the years. Beth was learning to recognize value beyond financial metrics. I was learning to assert my needs without fear of abandonment. Both lessons were uncomfortable at times, but necessary for genuine connection. The charity auction committee provided unexpected common ground, allowing Beth and me to work side by side as equals, each contributing our unique expertise. When Beth introduced me to her colleagues as my mother, the antique expert who built a multi-million-dollar business from scratch, her pride was unmistakable and remarkably free from the competitive edge that might have colored such an acknowledgement months earlier. On a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks before Christmas, Beth arrived for our regular dinner carrying a thick manila envelope and an uncharacteristically nervous expression. Is everything all right? I asked as she hung her coat in the foyer. Fine, she assured me, though her tight smile suggested otherwise. I just need to discuss something with you before Thomas and Mary arrive. We settled in the living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth and the antique grandfather clock I'd restored ticked steadily in the corner. I've been doing a lot of thinking, Beth began, turning the envelope over in her hands. About the house, about our arrangement, about everything, really. I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. When you first revealed that you owned the house, that you'd been letting us think we were paying a mortgage all these years, I felt manipulated, she admitted. But I've come to understand why you handled it that way, how my attitude toward financial dependency made it impossible for you to be honest without risking our relationship. She opened the envelope and removed a stack of legal documents. These are the papers to transfer ownership of the house to Thomas and Mary. I stared at her in surprise. Beth, please, let me finish, she said quickly. Drew and I have purchased a condo downtown, smaller, closer to the firm, more suited to our needs now that the kids are grown. We've been talking about downsizing. For years, this just accelerated our timeline. I studied my daughter's face, noting the calm resolve in her expression. This wasn't a decision made from hurt pride or financial calculation, but from genuine reflection. Are you sure about this? I asked. Beth nodded. The house should go to Thomas and Mary. It always was meant for them, really. The trust you established, the mortgage payments we made. They're building their own lives now, and this gives them options. Sell it and use the proceeds for their futures. Keep it as an investment property, whatever they decide. There was a wisdom in Beth's decision that moved me deeply, a recognition that releasing her claim on the house wasn't admitting defeat, but embracing a more authentic path forward. She was choosing to live according to her actual needs and values rather than appearances or expectations. I'm proud of you, I said softly. Beth's eyes glistened briefly before she blinked away the emotion. There's something else. She pulled another document from the envelope. I've also spoken with Ronald about adjusting my partnership track to allow for better work-life balance, fewer billable hours, more pro bono work. This was perhaps the most surprising development of all. Beth's relentless pursuit of career advancement had been the defining feature of her adult life, the justification for countless missed dinners, school events, and family milestones. That's a significant change, I observed carefully. It is, she agreed, but necessary. Our therapy sessions have helped me see how much of my identity I've tied to professional achievement, often at the expense of more meaningful connections. She smiled ruefully. It took my 73-year-old mother staging a revolution to make me reassess my priorities. That Christmas marked a profound transformation in our family dynamic. We gathered at my Victorian home on Maple Street. Thomas, Mary, Beth, and even Drew, who had gradually been finding his own voice in the wake of Beth's evolution. The dining room glowed with candlelight reflecting off the antique silver service I'd selected from my collection, no longer hiding its value or my knowledge of its worth. As we exchanged gifts, I noticed how differently we interacted now, the forced politeness of previous gatherings replaced by genuine warmth, the underlying tensions dissolved by honest confrontation and mutual respect. When Thomas presented me with a framed photograph of the four of us from Mary's nursing school graduation, I felt tears welling in my eyes. I remember that day, I said softly, tracing the edge of the silver frame. You all looked so proud. We were proud of Mary, Beth corrected gently. But we should have been equally proud of you, Mom. You were the one who drove her to study sessions, who quizzed her on anatomy terms, who kept her going when she wanted to quit. The acknowledgement, so simple yet so profound, marked how far we had come. There had been no catastrophic rupture in our relationship, no dramatic scenes of apology or forgiveness. Instead, there had been a gradual, sometimes painful renegotiation of boundaries and expectations, a daily practice of seeing each other fully and valuing each other honestly. Later that evening, after Thomas and Mary had left and Drew had fallen, asleep on the sofa, Beth helped me wash the fine china that had graced our holiday table. I saw Felicia yesterday, she said casually, accepting a plate from me to dry. At the mall, of all places. I glanced at her, gauging her expression. How was that? Surprisingly okay, Beth admitted. She asked how everyone was doing, mentioned she'd taken a job with a local gallery. She paused, carefully wiping a delicate teacup. She didn't ask about you, or about money, or about coming to family gatherings. It was just normal, like running into a distant acquaintance. And how did you feel about that? Beth considered the question with the thoughtfulness she'd been developing through our months of therapy. Peaceful, I think. I realized I don't need dramatic reconciliation or complete estrangement. I can acknowledge our connection without expecting it to be more than it is. Her insight reflected a maturity that had been emerging gradually, a capacity to hold complexity rather than reducing relationships to all-or-nothing propositions, to financial transactions, or to power dynamics. As we finished the dishes, Beth leaned against the counter, her gaze traveling around the warm kitchen with its vintage copper pots hanging above the island, and herbs growing on the windowsill. "You know, I've been thinking about something you said months ago when all this started," she said pensively, "about wanting to be valued for who you are, not what you have or what you can provide." I nodded, remembering our confrontation at the antique shop that had set everything in motion. "I didn't understand then," Beth continued. "I thought value was objective, measurable in salary or achievements or tangible contributions. But that's such a limited view." She smiled softly. "Value isn't just what you can count or calculate. It's in presence, in wisdom, in shared history, in countless small moments of caring that can't be quantified but shape who we become." Her words echoed the very lessons I had tried to demonstrate throughout her childhood, throughout Thomas and Mary's upbringing. Lessons that had been obscured by circumstance and misunderstanding, but never entirely lost. "When did you get so wise?" I asked, only half joking. Beth laughed, a warm sound free from the sharp edges that had once characterized her humor. "I had a good teacher. I just wasn't ready to listen until recently." As we moved to join Drew in the living room, where the Christmas tree glittered with ornaments collected over decades of family life, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here, from a flooding basement to this moment of genuine connection. The path had not been straightforward or easy, but it had been necessary. Perhaps that was the ultimate wisdom to be gleaned from our story, that true value lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we nurture. Not in what we claim, but in what we give. Not in how we are served, but in how we serve one another with honesty and care. And that it is never too late to stand in our truth, to demand respect, and to build relationships based on genuine recognition rather than convenience or obligation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.